We welcome you all to the Torah Umesorah Convention, and I think you'll find this session particularly interesting. Please give your attention to Rabbi Dr. Naphtali Hoff.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you. I would like to begin with a very quick think, pair, share. By the way, for you, I'm going to try to model instructional techniques as much as I do sharing actual content. So now, first of all, hopefully I'm modeling what we do when our space that we intended to start working in was not available until about 20 minutes late. And as a result, we're kind of scrambling, putting our lives in order. We are going to begin with a very brief think, pair, share exercise. Just out of curiosity, let's use fist to 5, if that's okay, to self-score on think, pair, share. So I have two things I need to define for you. Okay, fist to 5 is a self-assessment technique where you're telling me your comfort level about something. In this case, the something is think, pair, share. Are you with me so far? The way fist to 5 works is that if you have no idea what it is, you cannot make sense of it, it sounds like it just came off the boat from China yesterday, you put a fist. If you have super clarity about what it is, and you know exactly, you can get up and describe it to everybody else, and be careful because I might ask you to do so, okay? You put a 5. If you're anywhere in between, you assess accordingly. So you have a good sense of how it works. You do a 4 or a 3, not very clear, but something, a 1 or a 2. Can everybody please tell me your comfort level with what think, pair, share is and how to use it? Now in a regular classroom, this is very informative. I didn't see everybody over here. By all means, you can feel free to share with me as well. Normally you'd ask your students to put it in front of them, at least if it's for an answer to a question. In this case, it's okay, unless you are concerned that they might be embarrassed with sharing their responses, right? If you want true comfort, you probably have them put it in front of them like this. Now, for those of you who did a fist, I appreciate it. I applaud your honesty. We're going to learn the most with an open and honest exchange. So feel free to ask questions. I may ask you to hold off a little bit, but in most cases, I'm going to want to engage with you as much as I can. Now, for think, pair, share, you think about a question. Now this is the hard part, because there are a lot of social people in this room. Any of the extroverts, you don't have to identify yourselves, but you're probably the ones who like to talk and get right into conversation. We introverts roll a little differently. We'll talk about that maybe later, okay? But you want to think about a question and hold that thought for up to 60 seconds. Really can be challenging for some people. I will tell you when your time is up and ask you to turn to your neighbor and discuss what you thought about during your initial think time. So it's think quietly to yourself, which, by the way, for the introverts in your classroom, a great strategy. If you're familiar with Howard Gardner and the 8 intelligences that have been identified, one of them is called intrapersonal. There's interpersonal and intrapersonal. Interpersonal we get. We do cooperative learning, we do paired learning, we do all this kind of conversational stuff. But how often do we ask our students to reflect on a question silently, right? You're teaching, I don't know, the Akedah, for example, and you want them to really appreciate what was the nisayon of the Akedah. And before everybody blurts out an answer, you just say, hold your thoughts and think about it. Try to get into the mindset of what it's like to be an Avraham Avinu, okay? So we move from think, that we pair, we discuss, and then I'll ask a couple of you to share. Here is your question, okay? The question is as follows. When you have encountered a child who is struggling in your class, what intervention did you implement? Now, I understand the scenarios could be very different for you. Think about a student that's been struggling in your classroom, and what kind of intervention did you offer? That is the question. Take about 60 seconds to think about it, and then find somebody near you, and I'll tell you when to start discussing. Okay, please turn to the person next to you and share your scenario and your intervention. Okay, I'm sorry, I make everybody's life difficult by moving around so much. No, this is it, yeah. Okay, can I have everyone's attention? I'm gonna try this without the mic. Oh, come on, all right, fine. I won't record, okay, then we're gonna do the mic thing. Okay. Would anyone like to, first of all, very quickly, any comments about think, pair, share as an exercise that you might use in your classroom? Is that a yes? By the way, just as a fair warning for everybody, I hope you brought your wallets because I do moonlight as a part-time auctioneer for fine art. So anybody whose hand goes up, I will catch you. And it may cost you, so do be careful. Yes, in the back, go ahead. Did you want to comment on Think, Peer, Share as a strategy in your classroom? Active engagement. You noticed an interpersonal as well as an intra as well as an inter. Yes?
Is it shy for second grade?
Absolutely.
My initial knee-jerk reaction.
I'm sorry, the question was, is it relevant for second grade?
My initial knee-jerk reaction is if I did this, anarchy would break out.
That's really dependent on your capacity to set the framework for what the expectations are. Typically speaking, of all the cooperative learning techniques you could learn, this one is the easiest to implement because there's little movement and there's not a lot of back-end stuff you need to prepare. So if I jigsaw, which we're going to do later, Be'ez Hashem, that requires preparation of materials and organizing the groups and where everybody belongs. This is like super easy. It's like find your partner. One or two more comments?
I would be worried about if they were being left on their own to come up with the conversation.
Oh, so then you could probably model for them what a few good examples would look like and then give them an opportunity to try. Everything begins with practice and small bite-sized pieces. You never want to let the cats out of the bag and hope for the best. That's called chaos, usually. Yes?
I do it for months.
Uh-huh.
I do find that after a while.
It rubs off a little bit. So you got to have a lot of tricks in your tools in your toolkit. Yeah, absolutely. But thank you. Anyone else on this side? A comment about Think, Pair, Share before we move on? Can anyone imagine using Fist of Five, by the way? Just a quick show of hands. Anyone imagine using that? I know we have to impress upon our students the importance of being honest, right? There's no benefit in putting a 5 up if you really don't know what you're talking about, but you can use it often as a very quick encapsulation of where's everybody holding. In this room, there were some 5s, there were some fists, and a couple in between. So that gave me a sense that I really needed to talk about it. Okay, now we are going to talk, okay, so let's actually get your answers. Just a few people, I understand we have a lot of conversation that occurred. Would anyone like to share what your, very briefly, if you can keep it super succinct, that would be helpful. What was the challenge and what was the intervention? Rabbi? Right here, yeah.
There was a boy who was very bothered by people's knapsacks and coats on the floor. It disturbs his presence of mind.
Okay.
And what I created in the class is that the slogan, "We're not homeless." Everything has to be on the hook. And it created a very cautious atmosphere, and it was.
So you set kind of like a vision of the culture of what the expectation of the class, and then everything sort of fit into that. Beautiful. It's almost like a PBIS model in a sense. Anyone else? Someone on this side? Yes? I can't do it. It's in Hebrew, so I can't do this worksheet. So what was your response? Yes? Oh. Okay. So you demystified it, you broke it down into pieces, and then what happened next? Interesting. Excellent. Perfect. So I'm going to stop here because sometimes you get something really good and then you go back to a different direction and you get off the rails a little bit. If I may for a second, that was very helpful because it's getting us towards our topic of growth mindset. So you had students with a fixed mindset, which we'll define, where they said, I don't do Hebrew, whatever exactly their language was, and you began the process of helping them to determine how can you approach it and encourage them to be part of the solution. So there's a lot there. We'll have to unpack it. By the way, have you ever heard the philosophical question that if a tree falls in a forest and nobody was around to hear it, did it make a sound? Just nod your head up and down if you've heard such a question. Okay, if not, that's fine. So I have a 21st century version of the question that I often use. And the question is, if you delivered a professional development presentation and you didn't take a picture of it and post it on your WhatsApp status, were you really there? Are you with me? Like, I need to verify to my wife that I'm not like deep sea fishing now or something. So if it's okay with you, I just thought I would take a quick picture of us engaging in this, and then we're going to move right into our next thing. If you don't want that, you can sort of duck, I guess. But just quickly, let's see if I can do this without too much complication, and I apologize for any, let's see here, if we could do this real quick. All right, everybody, smile. Gentlemen in the fourth row, if you could just adjust your tie a little bit. Just kidding, just kidding, just kidding. Okay, I'm really not good at this. Really not good, as you can tell, but I'm trying. I have a growth mindset about taking selfies. Okay, let's move on. Probably the only selfie in the Torah Umesorah Convention this year. So, with that said, we're going to jump right into our topic, and that is growth mindset and fixed mindset as well as grit. Okay, we're going to define, always great at the beginning of a lesson, I'm sure you all know this, state your objectives. What are you here to accomplish? The more you know from the outset of what it is that you want to achieve, and just very quickly, for anyone who didn't get a handout, we have more. Okay, there are plenty coming, by the way. The more you know what you want to achieve, the easier it is for the learning to occur. Okay? I can go on and on about this, and I'm not going to. But I will tell you, as an adult learner in a doctoral program, I had a much easier time processing information when I knew what I was going to be doing with it. The more your students know why this is relevant and what they need to do to demonstrate mastery, the better the outcome will be. It's that simple. Okay? So we're going to define our terms. We're going to give examples of each. We're going to talk about some benefits, and then we're going to talk about strategies for grit as well. And by the way, this is not going to be me lecturing to you. We're going to do a lot of interactive conversation today, because if you don't use it, it's not useful. So I want you to be able to practice what we, so to speak, preach. Okay, here are your basic definitions. I hope I don't need to read to everyone. Can you all see the screen clearly? Everybody? Anyone who cannot see, please feel free to move forward to your convenience. But in essence, it's about your self-belief. And this, by the way, is critical. Okay? Too often we have a negative or limiting self-belief. I can't. And by the way, we're going to take a self-assessment soon to determine where you really are in things. Okay, you're not going to share it with me, although I may ask you for your total score. Okay? Growth mindset is about, I can't do it yet. I can't do it yet. Do you hear the difference? I can't do it, or I can't do it yet. In essence, that's what it is. Okay? So, what does that look like practically? This is a little harder to read, but I hope you could still see it. Again, you're invited towards the screen if you cannot. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but here are my two questions. We're going to do a ranking exercise, which means I'm going to ask you to rank these, and this is what I want you to identify. Listen carefully, because there are two parts to it. You may want to write this down. Part number one to my question is, which do you see? Let's focus on the red. We'll start with the negative and work our way to the positive. Which three of those on the left side of your screen do you think have the greatest negative implications on learning in your classrooms? Find the three and number them 1, 2, 3, please, in any order you wish. You could just jot it down on your paper, whatever works for you. So question number one is, what are the three with the greatest negative implications? And number two, which are the three that you see the most in your classrooms? They're not necessarily the same. The first one is, which are the three that are most destructive in your opinion? And the next one is, which are the three that you most commonly encounter? Are you with me? I might just jot this on the board so that I don't forget what I'm asking you. Let's see if there are markers here. Oh, beautiful, what a country. Okay. Destructive, negative. We're focusing on the things that have negative implications. Okay, so number one is, which ones are most destructive or harmful? Number two is, which are the ones that are most common? Okay, I hope you can see that. Once again, for anyone who came into the room later, did not get a handout, please do come to the front of the room. I have more. In addition, we are going to be going a little bit into the next period until about 12:40 because we got a late start. So just be mindful of the time. I will try to do a hard stop at 12:40. I technically have till 12:41, but whatever. Okay, we do need to move forward. So can anyone please, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand when you identify the one that you found to be your number one most destructive or harmful or damaging, whatever term you want to use, of these criteria. Are you ready? Believes intelligence and talent are fixed. Please raise your hand when I say the one that you feel is the most harmful. Number 2, believes effort is fruitless. Number 3, believes failures define who they are. Number 4, hides flaws. 5, avoids challenges. 6, ignores feedback. 7, views feedback as personal criticism. And 8, feels threatened by others' success. So a pretty wide range of responses. The first few had particularly strong responses, okay? Now, let's talk about the other one. Which one do you think is most common? We're only doing this one for now. Yeah. Which one do you think is most common? Are you ready for that one? Or do you need more time? Okay, let's give it a shot. Which one do you think is most common? Number 1, I'll just go by numbers. Is that okay? Number 1, it's fixed. Number 2, effort is fruitless. Number 3, failure defines who they are. The things you see the most in your students. Hides their flaws. Number 4. Number 5, avoids challenges. Wow. We just had our aha moment. Okay, number 6, ignores feedback. 7, views feedback as personal criticism. Also a large number. And finally, 8, feels threatened by others' success. Interesting. So it's almost like an inversion of what we saw earlier. Number 5 is the one you said you saw the most, which is avoids challenges. And we have to talk about that, right? Because frankly, we're in the business of challenging our students. Does anyone have any feedback or comments about what you heard in the video? I don't know if you even could hear it fully clearly. Yes? Oh, sorry.
Child's security, what he feels about himself.
Okay.
The more secure, he wants to know. The one who's weaker. So where the teacher is not the therapist, that's the only problem. When you got 30 kids in class, this is more a one-to-one dealing. Recess, you could try to build the kids something better than class.
Okay. So you mentioned security, and it sounded somewhat of like a self-confidence. Is that what you mean? Okay. Anyone else? What do you think she meant when she talked contrasting between the power of yet versus the tyranny of now? Yeah, what was your response? Oh, for sure. Yeah, without question. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Now is scary.
What I'm feeling now is going to last forever.
Yeah.
That's very stuck.
Right, and we have to perform now, and we have to do well in the moment, or so we think. Whereas yet is understanding that we're on a journey, sort of a continuum of growth. Unfortunately, because of the way that we structure our classrooms, so often with deadlines and ends of semesters and things like this, we have these artificial points in which we have to do all this assessment. And it makes it more difficult to assess on what we call a continuum or a journey. But that's in essence what it is. Yes? Okay. Right. The comment was, what are our report cards doing to our kids? And sometimes it creates I'm gonna interpret, right? So it's a disincentive for many kids. It's just deflating and discouraging. You know, we may call it an unnecessary evil in our classrooms to a degree. But these are challenges we have to deal with because these are realities in our classrooms. So let's talk about some strategies for how we can address the fundamental question of how do we build more mindset of positivity, of growth in our classroom. Let me just remind everybody what we're trying to accomplish here. We're trying to move from fixed to growth, okay? So in a fixed mindset, I think I can or cannot do X. And on top of it, if I'm good, this is, by the way, the part that I didn't really get into here, but she mentioned it a little bit when she said some students were devastated. Did you hear that? Now, why do you suppose some students, when they were confronted with math problems that were hard, probably they even were told that these are challenging math problems, why do you think some students reacted the way that they did and they were devastated and whatever else? And you could say because they had a fixed mindset, but let's try to unpack what really is going on. Yes? They're a failure, and it's a sort of a self-belief that gets perpetuated. There was a hand over here. Yes? They're defined by them failures, right. Now, it's interesting because if I have told you all along, we're going to get into this more when we talk about praising and reframing, but if I tell you all along how smart you are, can anyone think of why that would not be wise? In other words, in the context of conversation about students being told different types of feedback, why specifically would it be harmful or potentially hurtful for us to be praising intelligence as in, you're very capable, you're very smart, and then think about how it connects with her scenario? Yes? You always have to be smart, and you can't leave any room for anything different. Okay, what else? Let's see if anyone, yes? Yeah, so end of discussion. There's no room for, kind of closes the door on it. Someone over, yes? Either you have it or you don't, right? Either you're intelligent or you're not. Agav, it's not really our conversation, but it is important to remind ourselves, when we talked earlier about multiple intelligences, that really means we each have intelligence, perhaps though in different ways. We have a tendency in school settings to focus on certain intelligences over others. So we celebrate students who could learn auditorily, we celebrate students who could learn visually, and certain other contexts, because that's how information is largely presented. We have to remember that information enters our mind 5 different ways, or 5 different senses. We typically rely on eyes and ears, but smell, touch, and what's the other one? Hearing? No. Smell, touch, and taste are also oftentimes ways by which information enters the mind. And we have to be mindful of different ways of helping students incorporate the learning, organize the learning. It's a whole different conversation, but we have to reframe what smart looks like. At the end of the day, if I think I am smart, what am I going to do in a moment of challenge? Or better yet, if I've been told my whole life that I'm smart, whether I fully believe it or not is not the point for the moment. I've been told my entire life, smart kid, excellent, bright, whatever, terms we typically use, and then this same child encounters a moment of crisis, a question that he or she doesn't know the answer to, or a material that's maybe more difficult than in the past. What would be the response of such a child? Yes? Deflated. Anyone else? Yes? Lied to. Right? This whole thing was a scam. Yes? Yeah, I saw it. No, yeah, it was going up there. I'm sorry, repeat it, please. With a fixed mindset, being told that they were smart the entire time. They were devastated. So there's another, that's a feeling. What would be the action associated with it? What would then happen as a result? A kid in that situation, yes? Give up? Okay, let's go even one, that's great. Let's take it one step further. Why bother? But it's even more than that, in a way. What do I have to protect? I'm sorry? My image. I have to protect my image. And what's more important to a kid than an image? Can you think of anything? Half the times that our kids are misbehaving is because they'd rather be They'd rather be bad than stupid. We all know this, right? Any day of the week, kids would rather be bad than stupid. So we choose the option of being bad if we have to, because at least number one, we'll get negative reinforcement, which is better than no reinforcement or feedback. And number two, we then can sidetrack the real issue, which is I'm struggling. Okay, so we have a lot to unpack here, and let's jump into some strategies. So the first thing I think we need to do is to demystify. Just out of curiosity, I don't know where you are in your professional journeys. I don't know how long you've been teaching or anything like this. Prior to, let's say, 3 years ago, how many of you had heard of growth mindset and knew what it was? Could basically define it 3 years ago. How many of you 6 months ago could do the same? Okay, so that means right here, we can put our hands down, in this room of professionals, of adults, over 50%, 6 months ago, had no idea what growth mindset was. And maybe you didn't even know what it was until you walked in a short while ago. So if we, now you may have known it intuitively, you may have had some ideas, but certainly as a concept. Imagine the difference that it would make if we just tell our kids that our mindset makes a difference. And the way that we think about ourselves and our capacity to learn actually will influence our capacity to learn. That it's not all about what you are is what you always were and what you always will be. But it's, I'm on a journey of growth. Okay, can anyone here think of, without getting into specifics, an area of knowledge or let's call it a tactile skill that 2 years ago you knew little to nothing about or considered yourself limited or poor in, and now consider yourself to be at least basically proficient? Has anyone experienced growth like that in the last couple of years? Okay, so a number of you have just raised your hand. So if we could do it as adult learners, certainly our kids could do it as malleable children with tremendous upside and potential. But they need to hear it from us. We can't expect, I give a lot of talks on things like student readiness and student skills and note-taking skills and all this kind of stuff. We can't expect our kids to walk into a classroom necessarily ready to be a student. They're a body in your room, they're physically present, but are they ready to be a student in your room? And so if you can think about it from a mindset perspective, we can't necessarily assume that everybody's going to walk in and say, I can do this, I'm just going to try a little harder. We'll all just be the little engine that could, right? We can't assume that. We may have to teach that, and teach it oftentimes through personal example. Teach it through personal experience. Tell them about your own challenges. To me, one of the greatest things we could do as teachers is to model a process, any process. You want them to become better at learning Gemara or Chumash, for example. Open up something new in front of them and show them how you prepare for it. Show them how you actually analyze a pasuk and a Rashi. Show them how you analyze a sugya in the Gemara or anything that you're teaching. Don't just show them the finished product. Show them the process. Help them understand that it's okay to struggle. You will get there over time. And the more that we can demystify that for them and encourage them to go through it and help them understand that just like it took you 3 hours of preparation last night, you weren't ready to walk in if it was yesterday at this time to give this lesson now. You had all this legwork and preparation. Right? I walk in here fully prepared, hopefully, and maybe give a decent presentation. But you have no idea how many hours I spent working through this and reading about it and honing my skills and encouraging myself to make sure that I get up here and do it correctly. Nobody has that idea until I tell you about it. Then all of a sudden, we start to think about it and we recognize it. So here are some of the strategies. Again, for those of you who came in a little bit later, I got just a couple of handouts remaining here on the table. Happy to distribute them. Number one, normalize the struggle. Tell them it's okay. You're not weird. You're not limited. You're not stupid or bad. You're just struggling. Struggle is part of learning. Help them get that idea. Fundamental concept. Teach them to accept it and then inspire them to push forward. Give them examples of Gedolei Yisrael and Lahavdil, celebrities that you know, that they would relate to potentially, and tell them about how they struggled in various ways. The famous Thomas Edison with his 1,000 plus ways to not correctly develop a light bulb before he finally got the one that worked. Okay? And then many other examples. Whether you're using biographies or case studies, or scenarios that you encountered in your personal life, or you see others. You can't make this a full conversation all the time, but if you develop just enough time for it here and there, the message will start to resonate. And it'll make a huge difference. Any questions or comments before we move forward? 1 and then 2, please. Yes?
Is the problem getting worse or worse? Because the number of kids that have this issue is going.
I'm going to put the question to the group. Is the issue of fixed mindset increasing and becoming progressively more pronounced in our classrooms? The veteran teachers in particular, feel free to weigh in on this. Let's do 1 finger if it's getting worse, 2 fingers if it's about the same. Just curious. Okay, so I'm seeing more 2s than 1s. It doesn't mean that there's not validity to the 1. It sounds like many people see it's a problem that they've encountered for a while. But either way, it's a problem. Either way, it's a problem. Yes?
I think also because so much of today's generation is here and now,
Yeah.
I think the children don't have patience with us.
Right.
And they just, okay, so Lord, you're telling me that, yeah, okay, it's fine that I don't know it now because it's going to come magic, but what about right now?
Yeah, we live in a fast food society that embraces fast knowledge and fast sharing and fast everything. And so we have to be able to preach patience and help students know that we're not judging them. We'll be there, we'll support. Part of this, by the way, we'll get to this. I know you have a comment, I'll be right back with you. Part of this is just helping them know how you're going to approach it with them. If they know that you don't need it all in the here and now, it's going to put them at ease and give them the space to move forward towards growth, right? Someone talked a little bit about report cards. It's really not our topic, but if you're familiar with something called skills-based assessment, which is less about what grade did you get, but have you mastered a skill or not, and you have a continuum, that feeds much more neatly into the idea of growth mindset. Because it means I just have a series of skills I must master before being ready for whatever that next level looks like. So in some ways, conceptually, it's easier to work with. Let's do 1 and then 2, please. Yes? So yes, that is possible. I don't know that that's a mindset issue per se, or just a bigger issue, physiology and otherwise. Maybe, but all the kids are operating in the same confinement, and some of them are responding differently than others. So you can still apply a mindset to a circumstance. You know, an extreme example of this would be Viktor Frankl and the Holocaust, if you will. You know, in a very obviously torturous and confining environment, to still have the mental, right, and we see this with the Gedolim as well, the ability to transcend your circumstance. So mindset can still be applied in different situations differently. Your point is important, but for a different conversation. And I'm not big enough to deal with it anyway. So I don't know if I could help you with it. Yes?
Maturity plays a very big role. In other words, the whole concept of success is dependent on your abilities, and Hashem creates everybody with their own abilities.
Yeah.
And it's not looking at the next person and where he's holding, recognizing your strengths and your...
So if we, that's great. That's great. If we preach the Chanoch L'Na'al Pi Darko really at its essence, then I think there would be more internalization of that idea. Part of the issue, unfortunately, is that we've got 20 plus kids in a classroom, in most cases, all at once, and you may not be comparing them one to the next, which I hope we're not, but they're certainly doing it, right? Don't think for a second that the kids couldn't tell you the 3 smartest kids in their class, right? I remember very clearly, by the way, the power, the influence of societal pressure. Different conversation, but worthwhile just mentioning for a moment. There's a raft of research about this. When I was in 6th grade, my Rebbe asked a question. I cannot remember what the question was, please forgive me. But we had, our class was set up in like a U shape, but with corners. So it's sort of like a ches. And for whatever the reason, the question was asked to every student, and we were all supposed to respond in succession. So boy 1 responded, boy 2 responded, boy 3 responded. And a magical thing happened when we got to boy 7, who was smart boy number 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, each one had their own answer, they agreed, disagreed. All of a sudden, there was this transformation, starting with boy 8, all the way around till about boy 15, where nobody varied from number 7. That means everybody figured that smart boy number 1 is clearly smarter than me. So if he says that's the answer, then that's the answer. Smart boy number 2 was sitting in seat number 15, and he disagreed with smart boy number 1, and hence the answer shifted again all the way until we reached the end of the ches. Now, the question didn't stick with me, but the dynamic at play certainly did. We all know the players in our room. But sometimes it's up to us to create opportunity for different intelligences and different abilities to shine. Sometimes it's just about giving students opportunity to push through and to recognize the effort, if not more than, but at least in similar proportion to the actual result. That's on us. The messaging, the acknowledgement, the rewarding, that really falls on us. The more that we can place effort and emphasis on perseverance at the top of their mind, of what's valued in this classroom, right? You all know, I'm sure, the famous poem or message of Chaim Janat, that you make the weather in your classroom. Familiar with this? If you haven't, forgive me, Google it, find it. It's powerful. When we walk in and we have a positive mindset, when our energy is high, when we expect the best from our kids, that resonates with everybody. If we are short, if we are in a bad mood, if we're coming off of a crisis or whatever, we make the weather, whether it's shiny and 70 and clear and humid-free or low humidity, or whether it's stormy and troublesome, that is on us. Nobody does that more than us. We have to recognize and remind ourselves of that all the time. And if we pitch and champion a mindset in what we do, it's going to have a huge implication, even if they're in middle school and they've got 5 or 6 other teachers and nobody else is doing it. They'll know in your classroom that the mindset and the effort in all of this is valued, and I can shine here. So let's remember that. Let's remember that. We're in a system, but we still can be a rock of tranquility in a stormy sea. Comment or question? Yes.
You mentioned something about the teacher sharing the struggle of figuring out whatever they're teaching to the students.
Yes.
I'm taking a little bit issue understanding that because from my experience of being a Rebbe and teaching,
Uh-huh.
the students want to be very, very confident.
Yes.
They don't want to see that the Rebbe doesn't know, he didn't know, he doesn't know. They want to be
You're talking about the example of preparing, let's say? Okay, so you don't have to use that specific one. That's fine. My point was, it was not about you struggling so much. I just wanted them to see the process, that there's a human, if you will. Children have a tendency to put in a good way, certainly, to put their teachers and Rebbeim Moros on a pedestal. But we want to also remind them that you didn't just get there by snapping your fingers or being born brilliant. That's the idea that I was really getting at. And if you can communicate that there is a struggle, that there's a process, even if you get it, but you didn't always get it, even that I think has merit, right? That you weren't always the Gadol Hador that you've become. You were once, I don't mean to be facetious, but you once upon a time were like everybody else. And over time, with effort and perseverance and of course ability, you've become somebody they could look up to. They should know that about themselves as well. Because far too many kids give up on their dreams about whatever it is because somebody along the way told them either they were not capable or something else that deflated them and gave them a self-perception that didn't allow them to move forward. Please, if you don't mind holding that for a moment, Rabbi, I just want to get into this for a moment, and then please, but don't forget it, okay? So we talked about this before, right? Don't focus on intelligence. What are we focusing on instead? The process. What did you do that helped you get to where you are? We can't change, to some degree, we could help our brains stretch and grow. We can do that. but it's not because we just eat a different breakfast cereal or consume more vitamins. Nothing against all that health stuff, that's important, but really from a purely process angle, okay? So again, focus on the actions, not on the traits, for the reasons we discussed. What was the question?
So, follow, maybe taking issue with the last comment.
Yes.
Isn't it part of the growth mindset for a student to know that nobody's perfect, even the Rebbe, it is okay to make a mistake, and not only is it okay to make a mistake, but growth comes from making mistakes and recalculating it.
I would agree. I think, but you have to find the right balance, right? We don't want to turn ourselves into someone not to respect. At the same time, I think that when we unpack it in the right way, it could have very great value. Now, this is what I'm going to do. I'd like to go through this. Actually, let's review this first, and then you're going to have an exercise to do together, okay? We're going to jigsaw, but I'll describe what that looks like in a minute, okay? So on the left side, take a look at what the not so great options are. Instead, it doesn't mean these are bad necessarily, but consider the alternative to each one. I'll give you a few moments to just read them and give me any feedback you'd like before we move forward. I'm not going to recap the last slide with you any further or even get your feedback because of time. I am going to trust that you got something meaningful out of the concept of reframing. And you may want to just sort of jot down for yourself. It's fascinating that I've learned this many times over the years, but you may have enjoyed, hopefully you've enjoyed everything we've talked about. And maybe you've gotten 20 things out of today that you didn't fully grasp. I'm making something up, I have no idea. But if you could pick one or two and own those one or two as the things that you will now incorporate either in your instructional practice or in your planning or in your conversations that's different than when we started, I would call that a win. Because too often we think, oh, what a great presentation, and then 5 minutes later we forgot the whole thing. So think about one or two things now that you really appreciate, that's useful for you, that could speak to you and your students and make a difference, and jot it down somewhere so that you have it clear. This is what I will do, and this is what it will look like. Try to make it actionable. So that, and realistic, and we're not getting into goal setting right now, but certainly we could if we have time. Okay, very quickly thought about as like the level of scratchiness on your sandpaper. But grit also refers to a steadfast tenacity, let's call it. A willingness to put in effort, a willingness to persevere. I'm going to do a tremendous disservice by trying to talk about it in great length. I would encourage you, if you feel comfortable, to watch the TED Talk by Angela Duckworth. She's just like Carol Dweck is considered the mindset person, Angela Duckworth is associated with grit. Although I did see an article recently that was challenging some of the fundamental premises, if you will, of grit. But nonetheless, the idea that if we persevere and push and invest the necessary effort, we can go from okay to excellent. And there's a lot of research that tells us that the very best people, the best violinists, basketball players, whatever profession, what separates them from the very good is the level of practice. The very good, on average, put in somewhere around 8,000 hours of practice. The superior invested 10,000 hours of practice. And the 10,000 hour rule has become sort of the bar for people who want to reach that level of greatness. So if students understand, again, we're about demystifying today. This is about technique and strategy for sure, but it's simply about changing the way we think about ourselves. And if students start to appreciate that my mindset makes a difference, my efforts and my tenacity make a difference, they will start to approach learning differently as well. Briefly, a couple of more strategies before I wrap up. Number one, we talked about this before, to try your best to focus on effort, perseverance, whether it's part of the course grade or something else you acknowledge, but I think formal acknowledgement of that could be very powerful, helping students know that you notice and that you believe that their efforts will improve their situation over time. We also talked about modeling, sharing, demonstrating. Think about having them write a letter to a future student. Write a letter to a future student about your struggles and how you overcame it. and you tell this to your 6th grade class, or your 4th grader, or 8th grade, it doesn't matter, right? You tell them about your personal struggles as we've discussed. All of these will help to solidify the idea that we've been aiming after today. And have them reframe and adjust their thinking similar to what you just did. Now, one last thing, I will leave here copies. There is another worksheet. You won't have time to do it with others, but you can grab one if you want to just take it for yourself about incorporating this further into your professional practice. So let's try to recap, because I'm now on the 60-second mark. I know the bell's about to ring. Okay? So let's review at least what we set out to accomplish, what we did achieve, and perhaps what we did not achieve. We said we were going to introduce 2 terms, growth mindset as well as grit. I think we spent almost all of our time on growth mindset, part of that just based on the amount of time needed in order to properly approach it. And I didn't want to make it superficial for you. I wanted us to be able to go into some level of depth there. We described it as different from fixed mindset. We talked about strategies in which to incorporate it, ways we can be talking about it, things we could be modeling. We briefly touched on grit. I would encourage you to look at it more, about that issue of tenacity and perseverance. And then we at least heard from Dr. Dweck, and you have the capacity, of course, to listen to others as well on the topic. And my hope is that as you're thinking about, let's think about Monday morning or Sunday morning, when you go back to your classrooms the next time, or in the afternoon on those days, think about how can you have some kind of messaging ready that either that day or soon thereafter, you'll be able to implement into your classrooms and in your professional practice. I thank you all for being here. I know you had your choice of sessions, and I thank you for choosing this one. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
I'd like to thank Rabbi Dr. Naphtali Hoff.